Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. January in northern Minnesota means one thing to folks like me: ice fishing season. My buddies from the warehouse where I load trucks had been talking about Lake Winnebagoshish for weeks, planning a group trip that kept getting postponed. But that Saturday morning, after my divorce papers finally came through, 10 years of marriage reduced to a manila envelope, I decided I needed to go alone. 34 felt ancient that day, watching my breath fog up the windshield of my Ford F-150 as I pulled into the empty parking area near the public access point around 6 in the morning. The lake stretched out like a white desert, perfectly still, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I had been ice fishing since my father first took me out when I was 7 years old, so I knew what I was doing. At least, I thought I did. The forecast had promised clear skies and temperatures hovering around 15 degrees, cold, but manageable for a full day on the ice. I hauled my portable shanty, my auger, and my bucket of gear about 300 yards out from shore, past the clusters of permanent fish houses that dotted the area closer to land. I wanted solitude, needed it really, and the spot I chose sat isolated near a point where the walleye liked to congregate in the deeper water. By 7:30, I had drilled my holes, set up my shelter, and dropped my first line. The ice beneath my feet felt solid, maybe 10 inches thick based on the shavings from the auger. I remember thinking how therapeutic it was out there, just me and the cold and the rhythmic bobbing of my rod tip. No lawyers, no arguments about who gets the house, no watching my wife, ex-wife now, pack her things into boxes. Just ice, water, and fish. Around 11, the wind started picking up from the northwest. Nothing alarming at first, just steady gusts that made my shanty walls ripple and snap. I stepped outside to check on my tip-ups, those little flag rigs I had set about 20 yards away in a scattered pattern. The sky had changed while I was inside, gone from that crisp winter blue to a pale gray that seemed to press down on everything. I noticed the permanent fish houses in the distance looked smaller somehow, farther away than I remembered. Chalked it up to the flat light playing tricks, the way everything on a frozen lake can look distorted when the clouds roll in. I grabbed a thermos of coffee from my sled and poured myself a cup, watching the steam curl and vanish in the cold air. A few other trucks had arrived at the parking area. I could see their tiny shapes near the shore, but nobody had ventured out this far. That should have been my first clue that something was wrong. I was reeling in a small perch, maybe 6 inches long, when I heard it. A deep, resonant groan that seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating up through my boots and into my chest. Ice makes noise all the time, especially on big lakes. It expands and contracts, creates these eerie sounds that newcomers find terrifying, but veterans learn to ignore. But this sound was different. It was followed by a sharp crack like a rifle shot, somewhere behind me toward the north. I set down my rod and walked to the edge of my fishing area, scanning the white expanse. That is when I noticed my tackle box had moved. Not fallen over, not knocked by wind. It had slid about 3 feet to my left, leaving a faint scrape mark on the ice surface. I stood there staring at it, my brain trying to process what I was seeing. Then I felt it beneath my boots, a subtle, sickening tilt, like standing on a boat that had just caught a wave. I dropped to my knees and pressed my bare palm against the ice, feeling for movement. The surface was wet, slick with a thin film of water that had not been there an hour ago. My heart started hammering as I scrambled toward the direction of shore, or what I thought was shore. That is when I saw it clearly for the first time. A jagged black line cutting across the white maybe 40 feet ahead of me, stretching in both directions as far as I could see. Open water. The crack had separated my section of ice from the main sheet, and the wind was pushing me, pushing the entire frozen platform I stood on, slowly but steadily toward the center of Lake Winnebagoshish. I ran back to my shanty and grabbed my phone from my jacket pocket. No signal. Of course no signal. I was in the middle of nowhere, Minnesota, and the nearest cell tower was probably 15 miles away. I tried anyway, holding the phone up toward the gray sky like that would somehow help, watching those empty bars mock me while the ice beneath my feet continued its slow, terrible drift. The gap of open water was widening. What had been maybe 3 feet across when I first spotted, it was now closer to 8 or 10, the dark water churning with small chunks of broken ice. I thought about jumping it, making a run and leaping across before it got any wider. But the edge of my ice floe was jagged and unstable, pieces crumbling off into the water even as I watched. One wrong step, one miscalculation, and I would plunge into 30-degree water wearing heavy winter gear. Hypothermia would set in within minutes. I had read somewhere that you have about 10 minutes of meaningful movement in water, that cold before your muscles stop responding, and maybe an hour before your core temperature drops enough to kill you. The shore looked impossibly far now, a thin dark line on the horizon interrupted by the colorful dots of those fish houses I had passed earlier. I screamed for help, cupping my hands around my mouth and shouting until my throat burned. The wind swallowed every sound, carrying my voice away into nothing. I forced myself to stop panicking and think. My father had taught me that panic kills faster than cold ever could, that your brain is your best survival tool if you keep it working. I took inventory of what I had. The portable shanty, my auger, a sled with fishing gear, about 50 feet of rope, a small propane heater, some hand warmers, a half-eaten sandwich, and the thermos of coffee that was now barely lukewarm. No flares, no emergency beacon, nothing designed for this exact nightmare scenario. The ice floe I stood on was roughly the size of a basketball court, maybe a little bigger, and I could feel it rotating slowly as the wind and current fought over which direction to push it. I checked my watch, 12:47 in the afternoon. Sunset would come around 5, and after that the temperature would plummet from uncomfortable to deadly. I had maybe 4 hours to figure something out before darkness made everything worse. The gray clouds overhead had thickened, and I caught the smell of snow in the air, that particular metallic scent that anyone who has lived through northern winters learns to recognize. I decided my best chance was to make myself visible. I collapsed the shanty and spread the bright orange fabric flat on the ice, weighing down the corners with my tackle box, the auger, and chunks of ice I stomped loose from the edge. From the air, it might look like a distress signal. From shore, if anyone was watching through binoculars, they might notice something wrong. I kept checking my phone obsessively, walking to different spots on the floe hoping to catch a single bar of signal, but the screen stayed empty. The water gap between me and the main ice sheet was now at least 30 feet wide, a river of black that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. I could see that the ice I stood on was not uniform. Some sections were thick and white, others darker and thinner where the current had worn them down from beneath. I started mapping the safe zones in my head, staying near the center where the ice felt most solid, avoiding the edges where cracks spiderwebbed out with every gust of wind. Around 2 in the afternoon, the first piece broke off. I heard it before I saw it, a grinding, tearing sound like bones snapping. And then a chunk the size of a dining room table simply tilted and slid into the water on the north side of the floe. I watched it bob for a moment before the current pulled it under, gone in seconds. My territory was shrinking. I moved everything toward the center, piling my gear into a tight cluster around me, and lit the propane heater even though I knew I should save the fuel. My fingers had gone numb inside my gloves, and I needed to keep my core temperature up if I was going to survive long enough for someone to notice I was missing. The problem was that nobody would notice. My coworkers thought I was sulking at home after the divorce. My ex-wife certainly was not going to check on me. My parents lived in Florida now, retired, and we only talked on Sundays. I had told no one where I was going, had not filed any kind of trip plan, had just driven out here in a fog of self-pity and dropped myself into the middle of a frozen lake like an idiot. The snow started falling around 2:30, fat wet flakes that cut visibility down to maybe 100 yards. I could no longer see the shore at all, just white in every direction, the sky and the ice merging into a featureless void. The floe had drifted far enough that the water gap was now impossible to gauge. It could have been 50 feet or 500. I huddled next to the heater, wrapped in the collapsed shanty fabric for extra insulation, and tried to calculate my odds. Even if someone noticed my truck in the parking lot by nightfall, they would not know where to look. The lake covered over 60,000 acres, and I could be anywhere on it by now. Search and rescue would need boats, maybe helicopters, and in this weather they might not even be able to launch until morning. I thought about my father. How disappointed he would be if he knew I had gotten myself into this situation through carelessness. He had always said the lake does not forgive mistakes, that you have to respect it every single time you step onto the ice. I had not respected it today. I had been too wrapped up in my own misery to pay attention to the warning signs that must have been there all along. The light was fading when I heard the engine. At first, I thought I was hallucinating, my desperate brain inventing sounds to give me hope. But it grew louder, a distinct mechanical whine cutting through the wind, and I scrambled to my feet so fast I nearly slipped on the wet ice. I grabbed the orange shanty fabric and started waving it over my head, screaming words that made no sense. Just noise, just anything to be heard. Through the snow, I saw it, a single headlight bouncing across the frozen surface, an airboat moving fast from the southeast. Someone had seen my truck, or maybe spotted the orange fabric before the snow got too heavy, or maybe it was just pure dumb luck that a conservation officer was doing a routine patrol. The boat circled wide around my shrinking island of ice, the pilot assessing the situation. And then a voice crackled through a loudspeaker telling me to stay calm, stay centered, do not move toward the edge. They threw a rope on the third try, a thick yellow line that landed 5 feet from where I stood. I tied it around my waist with fingers that barely worked anymore, and they pulled me across the gap, dragging me over the unstable edge and through 6 feet of freezing water before hauling me onto the airboat deck like a caught fish. The officer, a woman named Colleen with a weathered face and no patience for small talk, wrapped me in thermal blankets and cranked the boat's heater to maximum. She told me I was lucky, that another hour and the flow would have broken apart completely, that hypothermia was already setting in based on how badly I was shivering. My core temperature had dropped to 94 degrees by the time we reached shore in the waiting ambulance. I spent 2 nights in the hospital in Bemidji, recovering from mild frostbite on 3 fingers and the kind of exhaustion that goes deeper than muscles. The doctors said I came within maybe 40 minutes of a very different outcome. I think about that number a lot now, 40 minutes between being here and being a body they would find when the ice melted in spring. I sold my fishing gear that summer, gave away the shanty, the auger, all of it. Some people told me I should get back out there, that you cannot let fear win, but they did not understand. It was not fear that kept me away. It was respect, the kind my father always talked about, the kind I finally learned the hard way on a Saturday in January when the ice decided to remind me that nature does not care about your problems, your divorce, your sadness. It just does what it does, and you either pay attention or you pay the price. Anyone who has lived through a real blizzard knows the silence that comes with it. That heavy, muffled quiet that makes you feel buried alive even inside your own home. I had been living in my grandmother's old farmhouse in rural Wisconsin for about 8 months when the worst storm in 15 years decided to roll through. She had passed away the previous spring, leaving me the property in her will, and I took it as a sign to start over after my marriage fell apart. My high school graduating class had their 10-year reunion that same year, which should tell you roughly where I was in life. Old enough to know better, young enough to still make stupid decisions. The house sat at the end of a 2-mile private road, surrounded by nothing but frozen cornfields and dense pine forest. My nearest neighbor, an elderly farmer named Walt Hubbard, lived so far away that I could scream at the top of my lungs and nobody would ever hear me. That thought had never bothered me before. The isolation was the whole point. I wanted to disappear for a while, to figure out who I was without a husband defining my every move. But when the National Weather Service issued a severe blizzard warning that Monday morning, predicting up to 3 feet of snow and dangerous wind chills, I started to feel the weight of just how alone I really was. I spent that morning making sure I was prepared for the worst. The pantry was stocked with canned goods, pasta, rice, and enough bottled water to last a month. I had filled the bathtub as a backup water supply, a trick my grandmother taught me when I was a girl visiting her during winter breaks. The wood stove in the living room was my primary heat source, and I had been splitting and stacking firewood since October, so I knew I could stay warm even if the power went out for a week. By early afternoon, the sky had turned that sickly greenish-gray color that always precedes something bad, and the first flakes started drifting down around 2. Within 3 hours, I could barely see the old tool shed that stood about 40 yards from the back of the house, just a dark smudge in a world that had gone completely white. The wind picked up around 5, howling through the gaps in the window frames, making the whole house shudder like it was trying to shake itself apart. I made myself a simple dinner of tomato soup and grilled cheese, ate it curled up on the couch by the fire, and tried to convince myself that everything was fine. I was safe. I was prepared. Nothing could touch me out here. Then, just after 7, I heard something that made every muscle in my body go rigid. A weak, desperate knock at my front door. For a long moment, I did not move. I sat there on the couch with my empty soup bowl in my lap, staring at the door like it had suddenly grown teeth. Nobody came out here. Nobody. The mail carrier did not even attempt my road in winter. I had a P.O. box in town for that reason. Walt Hubbard was 83 years old and had told me explicitly that he did not leave his house between December and March unless someone was dying. The knock came again, louder this time, more frantic, and I heard something else beneath the howling wind. A voice. A woman's voice, high and thin and trembling. I set the bowl down on the coffee table and stood up slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The voice came again, clearer now, and I could make out the words, "Please, please help me. Please let me in." There was something raw in it, something that sounded like genuine terror. I walked toward the door on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, and I pressed my eye to the small window set into the upper panel. What I saw made me take a sharp breath. A young woman stood on my porch, and she was dressed in nothing but a thin sweater and jeans. No coat, no hat, no gloves. Her arms were wrapped around herself, and even through the frost-covered glass, I could see her whole body shaking violently. She looked maybe 22 or 23, with dark hair plastered to her face by snow and wind, and her skin had taken on that waxy bluish tint that comes with serious cold exposure. She saw me looking and her face crumpled with relief, tears cutting tracks through the snow on her cheeks. "Oh, thank God," she sobbed, pressing her palms flat against the door. "Please, you have to help me. He's going to kill me. Please." I ran. I didn't know where else to go. "Please just let me inside." Her words tumbled out in a desperate rush, and I found myself reaching for the deadbolt before I even realized what I was doing. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to help this girl, to get her warm, to save her from whatever nightmare she had escaped. My fingers touched the cold metal of the lock, and then the wind shifted direction, and I saw them. The tool shed sat about 40 yards from the back corner of the house, a squat wooden structure my grandfather had built sometime in the 70s. For most of the evening, it had been nothing but a gray blur in the storm. But when the wind changed, pushing the snow sideways instead of straight down, I got a clear view of the yard for maybe 3 or 4 seconds. That was enough. 2 figures stood behind the shed, partially hidden by its bulk, and they were watching the house. They were not moving, not trying to get to shelter, not doing anything a normal person would do in a blizzard. They were just standing there in the dark, still as statues, their attention fixed on the porch where the young woman was begging me to open the door. I could not make out their faces. They were too far away, and the light was too dim. But I could see their silhouettes clearly against the white snow. Both of them were large, broad-shouldered, wearing dark winter clothing. One of them was holding something long and thin in his right hand. The wind shifted again and they vanished behind the curtain of snow. But I knew what I had seen. I jerked my hand away from the deadbolt like it had burned me. The woman on the porch was still crying, still pleading, her voice cracking with what sounded like absolute desperation. "Please, I'm begging you, I'm going to die out here. He broke my phone, I couldn't call anyone, I just ran. Please, please, I have nowhere else to go." She slammed her palm against the door and I flinched backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the rug. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Maybe they were other victims. Maybe they had escaped with her and were too afraid to approach the house. Maybe I was being paranoid and they were just neighbors I did not know about, checking on properties during the storm. But none of that explained why they were hiding. None of that explained why they were watching instead of helping. And none of that explained the way the young woman's eyes kept darting to the side, toward the corner of the house, like she was checking on something, or someone. I backed further into the living room, my hand finding the back of the couch for support. "I'm going to call the police," I said, loud enough for her to hear through the door. "They can come help you. Just stay there and I'll get help coming." What happened next is something I will never forget as long as I live. The crying stopped. It did not taper off, did not fade into sniffles or quiet sobs. It just stopped, like someone had flipped a switch. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the crackling of the fire behind me. Then the woman spoke again, and her voice was completely different. Gone was the trembling, the desperation, the raw terror. What replaced it was flat, calm, almost bored. "That's not going to work," she said. The words came out slow and deliberate, like she was explaining something simple to a child who was not quite getting it. I stood frozen in the middle of my living room, staring at the door, trying to reconcile what I was hearing with the broken, sobbing girl I had seen just seconds ago. She was not even pretending anymore. Through the small window I could see her face had changed too. The crumpled expression of fear had smoothed out into something blank and patient. She tilted her head slightly, like a dog hearing a strange sound, and looked directly at the window where she knew I was watching. "The phone lines are down," she said, that terrible flat voice cutting through the storm. "Cell service has been out for hours. Nobody is coming to help you." My phone was on the kitchen counter. I had not checked it in over an hour, maybe longer. I wanted to run to it to prove her wrong, but I could not make myself move. I could not look away from her face in that window, from the way she was staring at me with an expression that held nothing. No anger, no frustration, no emotion at all. It was like looking at a mask made of skin. "You should have just opened the door," she said, and something in her tone made it sound almost like a genuine piece of advice, like she was sorry I had made the wrong choice. "It would have been faster." Then she turned her head toward the back of the house, toward where I had seen those two figures hiding, and she nodded. Just once. A small, quick motion that meant everything and confirmed every horrible suspicion screaming through my brain. I heard footsteps then, heavy, crunching footsteps in the snow coming from the side of the house, coming from the direction of the back door. I finally broke free of whatever paralysis had gripped me and ran for the kitchen, praying that I had remembered to lock the back entrance, praying that the deadbolt would hold, praying that this was all some horrible nightmare I would wake up from any second now. The back door was locked. I reached it just as a shadow passed across the small window set into its upper half, and I slammed my palm against the deadbolt to make sure it was fully engaged. It was an old door, solid oak that my grandfather had hung himself decades ago, but the frame around it was original to the house, over 100 years old, and not nearly as sturdy as I would have liked. I grabbed my phone from the counter with trembling fingers and looked at the screen. No signal. She had been telling the truth about that much. The landline was in the living room, a corded phone my grandmother had never gotten rid of, and I ran back to grab it. Dead. Nothing but empty silence when I pressed it to my ear. They had cut the line somewhere outside, probably hours ago. Probably while I was eating dinner and feeling safe and congratulating myself on being so well prepared. A loud thump against the back door made me spin around, and I heard a man's voice for the first time, low and rough, muffled by the wood. "Open up," he said. No desperation, no fake story, no pretense at all. Just a simple command, like he expected to be obeyed. Another thump, harder this time, and I saw the door shudder in its frame. I needed a weapon. The thought cut through my panic like a blade, sharp and clear. I needed something to defend myself because these people were getting into my house one way or another, and I was not going to make it easy for them. My grandmother had kept a shotgun in the hall closet, a 12-gauge Remington that she used to scare off coyotes when they got too close to her chicken coop. I had never fired it myself, but I had watched her do it enough times, and I knew it was loaded. She always kept it loaded, said an unloaded gun was about as useful as a chocolate teapot. I ran to the closet and yanked open the door, my eyes scanning the dark interior, until I found the familiar wooden stock leaning in the corner. I grabbed it, checked that the safety was off the way I had seen her do 100 times, and positioned myself in the hallway where I could see both the front and back doors. The thumping on the back door had stopped, and for a moment the only sound was the wind and my own ragged breathing. Then I heard something worse, the sharp, splintering crack of wood coming from the direction of the mudroom, the small side entrance I had almost forgotten existed. They had found the weakest point. The mudroom door was flimsy, a cheap, hollow-core thing that the previous owner had installed sometime in the 90s. I had been meaning to replace it ever since I moved in, had even priced out solid wood doors at the hardware store in town. But I kept putting it off because winter was coming, and I had 100 other things to worry about. Now that decision was going to get me killed. I heard another crack, louder this time, and the sound of something heavy hitting the door again and again. I raised the shotgun and pointed it at the mudroom entrance, trying to keep my arms steady, trying to remember everything my grandmother had taught me. She used to say that the sound of a shotgun being racked was enough to stop most trouble before it started. I did it now, that distinctive chunk echoing through the hallway, and I screamed at the top of my lungs, "I have a gun! I will shoot you! Get away from my house!" For a moment, everything went quiet. The banging stopped. The wind seemed to hold its breath. I stood there in the hallway, the shotgun growing heavy in my grip, sweat dripping down my temples despite the cold. And I waited. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Then I heard something that almost made my knees buckle. The woman's voice coming from right outside the mudroom door, close enough that she must have moved from the front porch while I was distracted. "She's got a gun," she called out, that same flat tone carrying through the damaged wood. "Remington looks like a 12-gauge. Silence again. I could hear them communicating somehow, low murmurs, barely audible over the storm, and then footsteps moving away from the mudroom, moving toward the back of the house, moving toward something I could not see. I did not know if they were retreating or regrouping, and I was too terrified to move from my position in the hallway. Minutes passed. Maybe 5, maybe 20. I lost all sense of time, standing there with the gun raised, my shoulders screaming in protest, my eyes burning from not blinking. The wind continued to howl. The fire in the wood stove crackled and popped. And then, slowly, I became aware of a new sound, an engine. Faint at first, then growing louder, accompanied by the crunch of tires on snow. Headlights swept across the front window, and I heard a vehicle door slam, then another, then a man's voice shouting something I could not make out. I did not lower the gun. I did not move. I just stood there shaking, until I heard a knock at the front door. A firm, authoritative knock followed by the words I had been praying for. "County Sheriff, ma'am. We got a call about a possible break-in at this address. Are you all right in there?" It took me a long moment to respond because I could not understand how they had gotten a call when all my lines were dead. I kept the gun raised and moved slowly toward the front door, checking the window to confirm what I was seeing. 2 uniformed deputies standing on my porch, a county patrol vehicle parked in the driveway with its lights flashing blue and red against the white snow. "How did you know?" I managed to croak out, my voice barely recognizable as my own. The older deputy, a heavy-set man with a gray mustache, leaned closer to the door. "Your neighbor called it in, ma'am. Walt Hubbard. Said he saw headlights coming down your road earlier this evening. A vehicle he didn't recognize. Said it didn't sit right with him, so he kept watching with his binoculars. When he saw people moving around your property on foot, he called us right away." Took us a while to get here with the roads being what they are. I finally lowered the shotgun and opened the door with numb fingers, and I must have looked like a complete wreck because both deputies immediately stepped inside and started asking if I was hurt. I told them everything. The woman, the crying, the two figures behind the shed, the way her voice changed, the mudroom door. They searched the property with flashlights and found footprints everywhere, already filling with fresh snow. The mudroom door was hanging off one hinge. The frame cracked and splintered, where someone had been kicking it in. They found tire tracks at the end of my driveway, heading back toward the main road, but the snow was coming down so hard that any hope of following them was gone within minutes. The deputies stayed with me until morning, taking turns keeping watch while the other one dozed in the armchair by the fire. When the storm finally broke around dawn, more officers arrived, along with a detective from the county seat who asked me to go through my story 3 more times. They never caught the people who tried to break into my house that night. The detective told me later that this kind of thing, using a young woman as bait to get homeowners to open their doors, had been reported in a few other rural areas over the past year, always during severe weather, always targeting isolated properties. He said I was lucky. He said most people would have opened that door without thinking twice. I sold my grandmother's house 6 weeks later and moved back to the city, to an apartment building with a doorman and security cameras and neighbors on every side. Some nights I still dream about that woman's face in the window, the way it changed from desperate to empty in the span of a single breath. And I think about Walt Hubbard, 83 years old and watching the road with his binoculars during a blizzard, calling the sheriff because something just did not look right. I sent him a bottle of good whiskey and a thank you card before I left town. I do not know if he understood that he saved my life that night, but I will never forget it. I will never forget any of it. February of 2022 found me 6 months into what my divorce lawyer called the healing chapter, and what I called exile. 34 felt ancient when you were starting completely over, selling the house in Portland, taking a remote position with a software company, and moving into a farmhouse rental in rural Vermont that cost less per month than my old car payment. The property sat on 11 acres of nothing but birch trees and silence. The nearest neighbor, a dairy farmer named Gus Whitmore, who lived about 2 miles down Hadley Road. I had wanted isolation. I had wanted to hear myself think again after 3 years of arguments and accusations and slamming doors. My golden retriever, Penny, was the only company I needed, or so I told myself during those long winter nights when the wind screamed through the valley and the old radiators clanked like someone was trapped inside them. I had grown used to the sounds of that house, the way the floorboards groaned when the temperature dropped, the way ice would crack and pop against the windows like knuckles tapping glass. I thought I understood that place. I thought I knew every noise it could make. Wednesday started like any other day that week. Gray sky, coffee that never got hot enough, and a work call at 9 where my camera stayed off because I had not brushed my hair in 2 days. The weather report mentioned a storm rolling in from Canada. Nothing unusual for February in that part of the country, so I made sure I had enough firewood stacked on the porch and checked that the generator had fuel. By noon, the snow had started falling in thick curtains that erased the tree line within an hour. I remember standing at the kitchen window with Penny pressed against my leg, watching the world outside turn white and formless, feeling that particular kind of peace that comes from knowing you cannot go anywhere and no one can reach you. Around 3 in the afternoon, the power went out with a soft click, and the house settled into that heavy silence that always follows when the electrical hum disappears. I lit candles, started a fire in the wood stove, and felt almost grateful for the excuse to unplug completely. Then my phone buzzed with an emergency alert, and that fragile sense of peace shattered like ice under a boot heel. The message was brief and clinical in that way government warnings always are. An inmate had escaped during a transport accident on Route 12, approximately 9 miles from my location. The man's name was Carl Eugene Vickers, 41 years old, serving 18 years for aggravated assault and armed robbery. He was considered dangerous, possibly armed, last seen heading northwest into the Green Mountain National Forest, which meant he was heading directly toward the stretch of wilderness that bordered my property. Residents were advised to lock all doors and windows, report any suspicious activity, and avoid going outside until further notice. I read the alert 3 times, standing in my dim kitchen with the wood stove crackling behind me and the snow piling against the windows. 9 miles was not that far. In good weather, someone determined could cover that distance in a few hours. But in a whiteout blizzard with temperatures dropping below 0, surely no one could survive long enough to make it this far. That is what I told myself as I double-checked the deadbolt on the front door and wedged a chair under the handle of the back door that led to the mudroom. Surely the cold would stop him before anything else could. I tried to keep busy as the afternoon bled into evening. I fed Penny, heated soup on the wood stove, and read by candlelight while the storm howled outside like something wounded and furious. Every few minutes I would check my phone for updates, but the signal was weak and getting weaker, the screen showing one flickering bar that disappeared entirely by 6. The isolation that had felt like freedom that morning now pressed against me from all sides, heavy and suffocating. I found myself listening to the house in a way I never had before, cataloging each creak and groan, trying to separate the familiar sounds from anything that might be new. The wind threw snow against the north-facing windows in waves, and sometimes I could swear I heard footsteps on the porch beneath that noise, a rhythmic crunching that would start and start again. But when I pulled back the curtain and held a candle to the glass, I saw nothing but white. Just the storm, I told myself. Just branches falling, just the old house settling in the cold. Penny lay by the wood stove with her head on her paws, watching me pace with those calm brown eyes, and I remember thinking that if she was not worried, then I should not be either. That changed around 9. I had just added another log to the fire and was settling into the armchair with a blanket when Penny lifted her head suddenly, ears pricked forward, body going rigid in that way dogs do when they hear something humans cannot. She stared at the floor, not at the door or the windows, but at the floor, specifically at the old heating vent near the baseboard where the previous owners had installed some kind of grated cover. A low growl started in her throat, so quiet at first that I thought I was imagining it, then building into something I had never heard from her before. Penny was the gentlest dog I had ever owned, the kind who greeted strangers with a wagging tail, and had never shown aggression toward anything except the vacuum cleaner. But now she was growling at that vent with her lips pulled back from her teeth, hackles raised along her spine like a ridge of dark fur. I sat frozen in the chair, watching her, my heart suddenly pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. She would not look away from that vent. And then, beneath the sound of the wind and the crackling fire, I heard it too. A scraping noise, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere below the house. The farmhouse had a basement that I never used. The previous tenant had warned me about it when I signed the lease, said the stairs were rotted and the space was prone to flooding in the spring. I had gone down there exactly once in those first weeks after moving in, and found nothing but crumbling stone walls, a dirt floor, and the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow my flashlight beam whole. There were 2 ways in, an interior door in the hallway that I kept padlocked from my side, and a set of exterior cellar doors on the east side of the house that opened outward from ground level. Those cellar doors had a heavy iron latch on the inside, plus a security grate that the landlord had installed years ago after a break-in at another property he owned. I had checked that grate when I moved in, tugged on it to make sure it was solid, and then mostly forgotten it existed. But now, sitting in my candlelit living room with my dog growling at the floor, I thought about that basement with a clarity that bordered on panic. I thought about how the exterior doors were buried under snow. I thought about how the interior door was only 15 feet down the hallway from where I sat. And I thought about the sound I had just heard. That scraping, like something being dragged across stone. I did not sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, Penny would growl again, and I would snap back to full alertness, straining to hear whatever she was hearing. The sounds from the basement came and went in irregular intervals, sometimes silence for 20 or 30 minutes, then a sudden thump or scrape that made both of us jump. Around midnight, I heard something new, a metallic clinking, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone tapping a wrench against iron bars. I knew exactly what that sound was. It was the security grate. Someone was down there, testing the grate, trying to find a weakness in the metal. I grabbed my phone and tried to dial 911, but the screen just showed no service in that cruel little font, and I wanted to scream at it, wanted to throw it against the wall. The landline was dead too. The storm must have taken down the lines along with the power. I was completely cut off, alone in this house with my dog and a locked door and whatever was making those sounds 15 feet away. I thought about running, just grabbing Penny and bolting out the front door into the blizzard. But the snow was piled 3 feet high against the porch, and the temperature had dropped to -15. I would freeze to death before I made it halfway to Gus Whitmore's farm. So I waited. I sat in that armchair with a kitchen knife across my lap and a cast iron skillet within arm's reach, watching the hallway, watching Penny, listening to the sounds from below. The clinking continued for what felt like hours, sometimes fast and frantic, sometimes slow and methodical. I tried to picture what was happening down there. A man in the dark, hands numb from cold, working at the bolts that held the grate in place, desperate to get inside where it was warm. The image was so vivid I could almost see him, could almost smell the sweat and fear and frozen desperation. Every few minutes, Penny would look at me with those worried eyes, and I would whisper to her that it was okay, that we were safe, that the grate would hold. But I did not believe it. The sounds kept coming, metal on metal, and around 3 in the morning I heard a new noise, a groan of protest like something giving way under pressure. I gripped the knife so hard my knuckles ached. The groaning stopped. Then silence. Then nothing but the wind and the fire and my own ragged breathing for the rest of the night. Dawn came slow and gray, the storm finally dying down to scattered flurries that drifted past the windows like ash. I had not moved from the armchair in 8 hours, and my body ached in places I did not know could ache. My neck, my shoulders, the small of my back where tension had coiled like a fist. Penny had fallen asleep sometime around 5, curled into a tight ball at my feet, but I could not bring myself to close my eyes. When the first real light crept through the curtains, I forced myself to stand, joints popping, legs unsteady beneath me. I needed to see. I needed to know if what I had heard all night was real or if I had somehow imagined it, if the isolation and fear had finally cracked something loose in my mind. I pulled on my boots and my heaviest coat, grabbed the kitchen knife and stepped out onto the back porch for the first time since the storm began. The world outside was white and silent and impossibly still. The kind of stillness that makes you feel like you are the last person left alive. And then I looked down at the snow beside the house, and I knew I had not imagined anything. Footprints. Deep, heavy footprints in the fresh snow, circling the entire perimeter of the house. They started at the tree line about 50 yards out and approached in a wandering path, like whoever made them was searching for something, testing doors and windows before moving on. I followed the trail with my eyes, my breath coming out in ragged clouds, watching it loop around the front porch, past the kitchen window where I had stood watching the storm, around the north side where the old propane tank sat buried in a drift. The prints circled the house 3 times before they finally stopped, right at the exterior cellar doors on the east side. I walked over to that spot, moving slowly, the knife clutched in my frozen fingers. The cellar doors were almost completely buried under snow, but someone had dug them out. I could see the disturbed snow, the gouges in the ice where hands had clawed at the frozen ground. The doors themselves were still closed, the iron latch still in place from what I could see. But the footprints did not lead away. They stopped at those doors and simply ended, as if whoever made them had melted into the earth or been swallowed by the basement below. I ran. I did not think, did not plan, just grabbed Penny and my car keys and plowed through the snow to my Subaru, which sat buried up to its wheel wells in the driveway. It took me 15 minutes of frantic digging with my bare hands to clear enough snow to get the door open, another 10 to rock the car free from the drift that held it. My fingers were numb and bleeding by the time I finally got the engine started. But I did not care. I drove straight to Gus Whitmore's farm, fishtailing down Hadley Road at speeds that should have put me in a ditch, and pounded on his door until he answered in his bathrobe with a shotgun in his hands. I must have looked insane, wild-eyed, shaking, blood on my hands from the ice cuts, words tumbling out of me so fast I could barely understand them myself. But Gus just listened, nodded once, and called the county sheriff on his landline while his wife Eleanor wrapped me in a blanket and pressed a mug of hot coffee into my frozen hands. The deputies arrived within the hour, 2 young men who looked barely old enough to shave, and I led them back to my property to show them what I had found. They searched the woods behind my house for 3 hours. I watched from the kitchen window, Penny pressed against my side as they trudged through the snow with their flashlights and their radios, calling out to each other in voices I could not quite hear. They found more footprints in the tree line, signs of a makeshift shelter someone had built from fallen branches about a quarter mile into the forest. They found a torn piece of orange fabric caught on a bramble, the same orange as a prison jumpsuit, but they never checked under the house. I told them about the sounds, about the security grate, about the footprints that ended at the cellar doors and never came back out. They nodded politely and said they would look into it, but I saw the way they glanced at each other, saw the look that passed between them. Just a scared woman living alone, that look said. Probably imagined half of it. They left around noon with promises to patrol the area, and I stood in my driveway watching their cruiser disappear down Hadley Road, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. I did not stay in that house another night. I packed a bag, loaded Penny into the car, and drove to a motel in Burlington where I stayed for the next week, jumping at every sound, sleeping with the lights on. I called my landlord and told him I was breaking my lease, told him he could keep the deposit, told him I did not care about the money. He argued at first, threatened legal action, but when I explained what had happened, the storm, the fugitive, the sounds in the basement, his voice changed. He went quiet for a long moment, then said he would send someone to check the property. 3 days later, he called me back. His voice was different now, strained and hollow, like a man who had seen something he could not explain. They had found the security grate bent outward from the inside, 2 of the bolts sheared clean off. They had found scratches on the interior basement door, deep gouges in the old wood where someone had tried to claw their way through. And in the far corner of the basement, beneath a pile of old tarps and rotted insulation, they had found a makeshift nest, empty food cans, a filthy blanket, and a sharpened piece of metal that looked like it had been fashioned from part of the grate itself. Someone had been living down there. For how long, no one could say. Carl Eugene Vickers was captured 6 days after the storm, nearly 40 miles north of my property, suffering from severe frostbite and hypothermia. The news said he had been hiding in an abandoned hunting cabin, that he claimed he had been there the whole time since his escape. Maybe that was true. Maybe there was someone else in those woods that night. Some other desperate person who found my basement and spent hours trying to break through to where I sat, waiting with my knife. I tell myself that sometimes, when I wake up at 3 in the morning and cannot fall back asleep, I tell myself it was not him, that it was just some homeless person seeking shelter, that I was never really in danger. But I remember the way Penny growled at that vent. I remember the sound of metal scraping against metal in the darkness below my feet. And I remember those footprints in the snow, the ones that circled my house 3 times before stopping at the cellar doors and never coming back out. I live in an apartment now, 3rd floor, no basement, no attic, no crawl space. Penny still sleeps at the foot of my bed, and sometimes, late at night, I catch her staring at the heating vent near the baseboard. When she does that, I do not sleep. I just sit there in the dark, listening, waiting for a sound that I pray will never come again. Ice storms in the Pacific Northwest are rare, which is exactly why nobody was prepared when one hit our region in early 2024. My neighborhood in a small town outside Seattle basically shut down overnight. Schools closed, businesses locked up, and by the second day, the power grid had collapsed across 3 counties. At 26, still finishing up my nursing degree while working part-time at a veterinary clinic, I thought I had a decent handle on emergencies. My apartment complex sits at the end of Birchwood Lane, right next to a small cluster of older houses that have been there since the 70s. One of those houses belonged to Howard Freely, an 83-year-old widower who had lived alone since his wife passed 6 years ago. Howard and I had developed a friendly routine over the 2 years since I moved in. I would shovel his walkway in winter. He would leave bags of homegrown tomatoes on my doorstep in summer. He was sharp, funny, and always had a story about his days working as an electrician for the county. When I called his landline that Thursday morning and got no answer, I figured the phone lines were down like everything else. By noon, the temperature had dropped to 19 degrees and the ice kept coming. I bundled up in 3 layers, grabbed my flashlight and a thermos of hot coffee, and made my way across the frozen yard to Howard's place. The walk that usually took 2 minutes became a 10-minute shuffle across what felt like a skating rink. His house looked dark, obviously, like every other building on the block, but something about the stillness bothered me. No smoke from the chimney, no movement behind the frost-covered windows. I knocked on the front door and waited, my breath forming thick clouds in the frigid air. Nothing. I knocked again, harder this time, calling out his name. After what felt like forever, I heard shuffling inside. Slow, deliberate footsteps approaching the door. The deadbolt clicked, and the door opened just a crack, revealing a sliver of Howard's face illuminated by the gray daylight. His eyes, usually warm and crinkled with humor, looked different somehow. Flat, suspicious. He stared at me like he was trying to remember something important, and when he finally spoke, his voice came out thin and uncertain. "Who sent you here?" I laughed at first, thinking he was joking around the way he sometimes did. "Howard, it's me, Nate. From the apartments next door, I brought you some coffee." I held up the thermos like it was proof of my identity. He didn't move, didn't open the door any wider. His one visible eye just kept scanning my face, searching for something. The silence stretched between us, and I could feel the cold biting through my jacket. Finally, he pulled the door open enough for me to step inside, but he didn't say anything welcoming. He just shuffled backward into the dark hallway, keeping his eyes locked on me the whole time. The house was freezing, maybe 50 degrees at most, and I could see my breath even indoors. Howard was wearing a heavy wool coat over what looked like 2 sweaters, and he had a knit cap pulled down almost to his eyebrows. He looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile, like the cold had shrunk him somehow. I asked if he was okay, if he had enough food and water, and he just nodded slowly without really answering. The living room was lit by a single kerosene lantern sitting on the coffee table, casting long shadows across the walls. Old photographs lined every surface, Howard with his late wife Meredith, family gatherings from decades past, faded images of people I didn't recognize. I set the thermos down and started explaining that the power company said it could be another 2 or 3 days before they restored electricity to our area. Howard lowered himself into his recliner, the leather creaking beneath him, and watched me with that same unnerving stillness. "You're not from the apartments," he said suddenly, his voice harder now. "I know the boy from the apartments. Young kid, glasses, drives a blue truck." My heart sank a little because he was describing me. I do wear glasses, and my truck is a faded blue Ford I bought used 3 years ago. I reminded him of this gently, told him we had talked just last week about the weather forecast. He shook his head slowly, deliberately, like I was trying to trick him with an obvious lie. "No," he said. "That boy wouldn't come in here pretending to help. You people wait for storms like this. Wait for the lights to go out so nobody sees what you do." I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that Howard was 83 years old, alone, probably dehydrated, and sitting in a freezing house with no power. Confusion in elderly people can spike under stress. I had learned that much in my nursing classes. I kept my voice soft and steady, explaining that I just wanted to make sure he was safe. that I could help him get his fireplace going or bring him back to my apartment where I had a small propane heater running. Howard's jaw tightened, and he gripped the armrests of his recliner like he was bracing for something. "You stay right there," he said, pointing a bony finger at me. "Don't move." He pushed himself up from the chair with effort and disappeared down the hallway toward the back of the house. I stood there in the dim glow of the kerosene lamp, listening to his footsteps creak across the old hardwood floors. Part of me wanted to leave, just walk out the front door and call someone. But who? The roads were impassable. Cell service was barely functioning, and the nearest police station was 12 miles away through solid ice. I heard a drawer slide open somewhere in the back, then the unmistakable metallic click of something heavy being handled. Howard came back into the living room carrying a shotgun. It was an old Remington, the kind with a wooden stock worn smooth from decades of use, and he held it across his chest with both hands like he knew exactly what he was doing. My entire body went rigid. I raised my hands slowly, palms out, and took a small step backward toward the door. "Howard, please," I said, trying to keep my voice from cracking. "It's Nate. We've known each other for 2 years. You gave me tomatoes last August, remember? The big heirloom ones from your garden." He didn't lower the gun. His eyes were locked on mine, and in the flickering lantern light I could see something terrible swimming behind them. Not anger exactly, but fear. Deep, irrational, consuming fear. "I know what you're here for," he whispered. "Same thing they all want. You think because I'm old, because I'm alone, you can just walk in and take everything. But I've been ready. I've been ready for years." The barrel of the shotgun drifted slightly toward my chest, and I realized with sickening clarity that I could not simply walk out of this house. Outside, I could hear the wind picking up again, ice pellets rattling against the windows like handfuls of thrown gravel. The gray light coming through the curtains was already fading, and I knew that in another hour it would be completely dark. I thought about my options, running through them one by one in my head while trying to keep my breathing steady. If I bolted for the door, Howard might shoot. His hands looked steady enough, and at this range he wouldn't miss. If I tried to reason with him, I might just make things worse, feed into whatever delusion had taken hold of his mind. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another few degrees, and I noticed my fingers were going numb. Howard gestured with the shotgun toward the couch against the far wall. "Sit down," he ordered. "Sit down and keep your hands where I can see them." I did what he said, lowering myself onto the cold cushions slowly, never taking my eyes off the gun. He remained standing near his recliner, the weapon still trained on me, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. The kerosene lamp flickered, sending shadows dancing across his weathered face, and I tried desperately to find some trace of the Howard I knew, the man who had helped me jumpstart my truck last winter, who had told me stories about building his house with his own hands back in 1978. "Howard," I said carefully, keeping my voice as gentle as I could manage, "when did you last eat something? When did you last drink water?" He blinked at me, and for just a second I saw confusion flicker across his features. Not the paranoid suspicion, but genuine uncertainty. "I had coffee this morning," he said, though his voice wavered like he wasn't entirely sure. "Meredith made it before she left for the store." My chest tightened at that. Meredith had been dead for 6 years. I didn't correct him, didn't want to risk triggering something worse, but now I understood what I was dealing with more clearly. Dehydration, hypothermia, isolation. Any one of those could cause cognitive decline in someone his age, but all three together could create a perfect storm of confusion and paranoia. The Howard standing in front of me with a loaded shotgun wasn't evil or dangerous by nature. He was terrified, lost in some fractured version of reality where his dead wife was still alive, and strangers were coming to rob him in the dark. But understanding that didn't make the gun any less real, didn't make my situation any less desperate. I needed to keep him talking, keep him calm, and somehow find a way to either get that weapon away from him or get myself out of this house before something irreversible happened. I decided to try a different approach. Instead of insisting on who I was, I would step into his world, Try to meet him where his mind had taken him. "You're right to be careful," I said slowly, keeping my hands visible on my knees. "There are bad people out there, people who take advantage of situations like this." Howard's grip on the shotgun loosened just a fraction, and he tilted his head slightly, listening. "But I'm not one of them. I'm just a neighbor who was worried about you. Meredith would want someone checking in on you, wouldn't she?" At the mention of his wife's name, something shifted in his expression. The hardness around his eyes softened, and for a moment he looked almost lost, like a child trying to remember something important. "Meredith worries too much," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "Always telling me to be careful, to lock the doors, to keep the gun loaded." He lowered the barrel slightly, pointing it more toward the floor than at my chest. I felt a tiny spark of hope flicker in my gut. The kerosene lamp sputtered, the flame dancing wildly before settling again, and in that wavering light I saw tears forming in the corners of Howard's eyes. "She hasn't come back yet," he said, his voice cracking. "She went to the store hours ago. The roads must be bad." I swallowed hard, trying to figure out how to navigate this moment without shattering his fragile state. Part of me wanted to tell him the truth, that Meredith was gone, that she had been gone for years, that he was living in a memory that no longer existed. But I knew that could break him completely, could send him spiraling into something even more dangerous. So instead, I nodded gently and said, "The roads are really bad, Howard. She's probably waiting it out somewhere safe. She'll be back when the storm passes." He seemed to accept this, his shoulders dropping slightly as some of the tension left his body. But he didn't put the gun down. He shuffled over to the window, pulling back the frost-covered curtain with one hand while keeping the Remington clutched in the other. Outside, the world had become a solid sheet of white and gray, ice coating every surface, the sky heavy with clouds that promised more to come. "I don't like this," he whispered. "I don't like any of this." Neither did I. My phone was in my pocket, but I had checked it before coming over. 2% battery and no signal. Even if I could call for help, no one was coming through that ice. The next hour passed in a kind of surreal standoff. Howard wouldn't let me leave, but he also wouldn't put the gun down. He sat in his recliner with the Remington across his lap, watching me with that mixture of suspicion and confusion that had become his default expression. I stayed on the couch, my hands visible at all times, talking to him in slow, careful sentences about nothing in particular. The weather, the neighborhood, stories about the veterinary clinic where I worked. Sometimes he would respond, offering fragments of memories that jumped between decades without warning. One minute he was telling me about wiring a house in 1982, the next he was asking if I had seen his daughter lately. I didn't know Howard had a daughter. He had never mentioned her in the 2 years I'd known him. When I asked her name, he went quiet for a long time before whispering, "Lorraine," and something about the way he said it made me think they hadn't spoken in years. The darkness outside had become complete now, the windows nothing but black mirrors reflecting the dim glow of the kerosene lamp. The temperature inside the house had dropped into the low 40s, and I could see my breath with every exhale. I asked Howard if I could light a fire in the fireplace, and he shook his head sharply, saying that the chimney hadn't been cleaned and we would die from the smoke. Around 8 o'clock, Howard's energy seemed to collapse all at once. His eyelids grew heavy, his head began to droop, and the shotgun slipped sideways in his grip. I watched him carefully, barely breathing, waiting for the moment when I might be able to move. His chin touched his chest, and for a few seconds I thought he had fallen asleep completely. I shifted my weight forward on the couch, preparing to stand, to cross the room and gently take the weapon from his hands. But the moment I moved, his eyes snapped open with startling clarity, and the barrel swung back toward me. "Don't," he said, his voice suddenly sharp and lucid. "I know what you're doing. You're waiting for me to let my guard down." My heart hammered against my ribs as I eased back into the cushions, raising my hands again in surrender. "I'm not going anywhere, Howard, I promise." He stared at me for a long moment, that terrible fear swimming in his eyes again. And then his expression crumpled into something that looked almost like grief. "I'm so tired," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so tired of being afraid all the time. I don't even remember what I'm supposed to be afraid of anymore." In that moment, I saw him clearly, not as a threat, but as a man whose mind was betraying him, who was trapped in a prison of confusion and terror that he couldn't escape. I made a decision then, one that could have gotten me killed but felt like the only right thing to do. I stood up slowly, keeping my movements deliberate and visible, and I walked toward him. Howard raised the shotgun, his finger hovering near the trigger, but I didn't stop. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice rising in panic. "Stay back." I kept walking, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, until I was standing right in front of him, close enough that if he pulled the trigger, there would be nothing left of me. I looked into his eyes, those confused, frightened, exhausted eyes, and I said softly, "Howard, you're cold, you're tired. You haven't eaten in a long time. I'm going to sit down next to you now and we're going to figure this out together. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm not here to take anything. I'm just your neighbor, and I'm worried about you." For a long, terrible moment, he just stared at me, the barrel of the Remington pressed against my stomach. I could feel the cold metal through my jacket. Then something in his face shifted, like a cloud passing away from the sun, and he lowered the gun. It clattered to the floor between us, and Howard began to cry, deep, racking sobs that shook his entire body. I spent the rest of that night sitting beside him in the freezing dark, feeding him crackers and water I found in his kitchen, wrapping blankets around both of us to conserve warmth. He drifted in and out of lucidity, sometimes calling me by my name, sometimes calling me names I didn't recognize, his brother maybe, or an old friend from decades past. By morning, the storm had finally broken. Pale sunlight streamed through the icy windows, and I heard the distant rumble of a plow working its way down the main road. I managed to get a weak signal on my phone and called for an ambulance. When the paramedics arrived, Howard was calm, almost peaceful, though he had no memory of holding me at gunpoint for hours. They took him to the hospital, where he was diagnosed with severe dehydration and early-stage hypothermia, both of which had triggered an acute episode of delirium on top of what doctors later confirmed was progressing dementia. His daughter Lorraine flew in from Ohio 3 days later. They had been estranged for over a decade, but the crisis brought her back. Howard moved into an assisted living facility that spring, and I visited him a few times before he passed away the following winter. He never remembered that night, never knew how close he came to killing me, or how close I came to running and leaving him alone in that frozen house. But I remember every second of it, and sometimes, when the power flickers during a storm, I still feel that cold metal pressed against my stomach, still hear his broken voice asking me who sent me there. My wife Naomi and I had hiked Crescent Peak maybe 30 times since we moved to Colorado. We knew that trail, the way you know the hallway to your bathroom at night. Every route, every boulder, every switchback where the pines opened up to show the valley below. We had done it in spring when the wildflowers exploded across the meadows, in fall when the aspens turned the mountain into a wall of gold, and yes, in winter, when the snow transformed everything into this silent cathedral of white and gray. By 2024, after 6 years of marriage and countless weekends on that mountain, we considered ourselves experienced enough to handle a February hike. The forecast showed clear skies until evening, temperatures hovering around 20 degrees, wind minimal. We packed our usual winter gear, hand warmers, extra layers, emergency blankets, granola bars, and left our car at the familiar trailhead parking lot around 9 in the morning, expecting to reach the summit by noon and be back down before 3. For the first 2 hours, everything went exactly as planned. Naomi walked ahead of me like she always did, her red jacket a bright beacon against the snow, her breath puffing out in little clouds that caught the morning light. We talked about normal things, her sister's pregnancy, the leak in our basement that we kept putting off fixing, whether we should finally get a dog now that we had the yard for it. The trail was packed down from other hikers, easy to follow, and we passed a few people coming down who nodded and mentioned the views from the top were spectacular today. I remember feeling this deep contentment, this sense that life was exactly as it should be. Naomi turned around at one point and smiled at me, her cheeks pink from the cold, and I thought about how lucky I was that she actually enjoyed these hikes instead of just tolerating them for my sake. We stopped at our usual spot, a flat rock overlooking a frozen creek, to drink some water and share a protein bar. That was around 11:15, and the sky was still perfectly blue, not a single cloud in sight. The weather changed so fast that I still have trouble believing it actually happened that way. One moment we were walking through sunshine, the next the temperature dropped like someone had opened a freezer door, and this gray wall came rolling over the ridge above us. I have seen storms move in quickly before, but nothing like this. Within maybe 10 minutes, the sky went from clear to completely overcast, and the first flurries started falling. Light at first, almost pretty, the kind of snow you see in Christmas movies. Naomi laughed and stuck out her tongue to catch a flake, and I pulled out my phone to check if there was any updated weather alert. No signal, which was normal for that elevation, but the radar from that morning had shown nothing coming our way until after midnight. We decided to skip the summit and head back down, figuring we could outpace whatever was coming. That decision probably saved my life, though it almost cost me Naomi. By the time we reached the switchback where the trail curves around a massive granite outcrop, visibility had dropped to maybe 50 feet. The snow was no longer light and pretty. It was coming down sideways, driven by a wind that seemed to cut right through every layer I was wearing. I could barely keep my eyes open against it, and the trail ahead had disappeared under a fresh blanket of white. Naomi was still in front of me, but her red jacket had faded to a dim blur, and I had to shout for her to hear me over the wind. We stopped to put on our goggles and zip everything up tight, standing close together with our backs to the gust. I remember her face when she looked at me, not scared exactly, but serious in a way I rarely saw from her. She grabbed my hand and said we needed to stay close, no more than arm's length apart, and I nodded because I knew she was right. We started walking again, slower now, trying to follow what we thought was the trail. That was our first mistake. In a whiteout, what you think is the trail is just your brain trying to make sense of nothing. I do not know exactly when we got separated. That is the part that haunts me the most, that I cannot pinpoint the moment I lost her. We were holding hands, and then at some point we were not, and I assumed she had just moved slightly ahead like she always did. I kept walking, head down against the wind, following what I thought were her footprints in the snow. But fresh snow fills footprints in seconds during a storm like that, and I was probably following nothing, just depressions in the surface, shadows, my own desperate hope. I called her name, but the wind swallowed the sound before it could travel more than a few feet. I stopped and turned in a full circle, shouting Naomi over and over, and all I saw was white in every direction. No red jacket, no movement, no response. Just this endless, swirling, suffocating white that seemed to press in from all sides. I pulled out my phone with shaking fingers. Still no signal, battery at 62%, and the cold was draining it fast. I had maybe a few hours before it died completely. The rational part of my brain told me to stay put. Every survival guide, every article I had ever read about getting lost in the wilderness said the same thing. Do not move. Stay where you are. Let rescuers find you. But Naomi was out there somewhere, possibly walking in the wrong direction, possibly hurt, and the thought of just standing still while she disappeared into that storm was unbearable. I made a decision that I will second guess for the rest of my life. I decided to retrace my steps and find her. The problem was, I had no idea which direction my steps had come from. Everything looked identical. I picked a direction that felt right, that seemed to slope downward the way the trail should, and I started walking. Every few seconds I would stop and shout her name, listening for any response, hearing nothing but wind. I walked for what felt like 20 minutes, maybe 30, and slowly I began to realize that the terrain around me did not match anything I remembered from the trail. The trees were different, thicker, older, with branches that hung low and heavy with snow. There were no trail markers, no boot prints, no sign that any human had ever walked through here before. And then I stumbled into the clearing, and everything got worse. At first I thought I had found a road, some kind of access path that might lead me back to civilization. The ground was flat and wide, cutting through the forest in a straight line, and I felt a surge of hope so intense that I almost cried. But as I walked further, I realized it was not a road at all. It was a logging track, one of those routes they carve through the forest to drag out felled trees. And it was surrounded by destruction. Stumps poked out of the snow like rotten teeth, some fresh cut with pale wood showing, others old and gray and split by weather. Heavy machinery had churned the ground into frozen ruts and ridges that the snow only partially concealed, creating a landscape that looked almost lunar in its desolation. The tracks went off in multiple directions, branching and crossing in ways that made no sense to me. I had never seen this area on any map, never heard anyone mention logging operations on this side of the mountain. I was somewhere I was not supposed to be, somewhere that did not match the terrain I had memorized over 6 years of hiking. I tried to orient myself using what little I could see. The storm had let up slightly, not stopping but thinning enough that I could make out shapes maybe 100 feet away instead of 50. The problem was that nothing I saw gave me any useful information. Mountains rose in every direction, their peaks hidden by clouds, and they all looked the same, just white slopes vanishing into gray sky. I pulled out my phone again, desperate for even one bar of signal, but there was nothing. The battery had dropped to 41%. I thought about Naomi, about how she must be looking for me too, probably making the same mistakes I was making, wandering further and further from where we had separated. If she went back to the car and called for help, they would search the trail, the route we always took. They would not think to look over here, in this unmarked section of forest that probably did not even have a name. And even if they did search here eventually, it would not be until tomorrow at the earliest. And tonight the temperature was supposed to drop to 15 below zero. I knew the math. I knew what that meant. Hypothermia would set in within hours of sunset if I could not find shelter or find my way back. I made myself stop and think, really think, instead of just reacting. Panic was the enemy now, not just the cold. I remembered something my father told me once when I was a kid, and we got turned around during a hunting trip in Wyoming. Water flows downhill, and people build things near water. If I could find a stream or creek, I could follow it down the mountain, and eventually it would lead me somewhere. The logging operation had to have an access road, a way for trucks to get in and out, and that road would connect to a real highway eventually. I closed my eyes and listened past the wind, trying to hear anything that sounded like moving water. Nothing. The world was silent except for the hiss of snow and the creak of frozen branches. I picked the logging track that seemed to head most consistently downhill and started walking, counting my steps to keep my mind focused on something other than the growing numbness in my toes. 100 steps, 200, 300. The track curved and split, and I chose the left fork because it kept going down. 400. 500. My feet were starting to feel clumsy, like they belonged to someone else, and I had to concentrate on each step to make sure I was actually lifting them high enough to clear the snow. The light was fading by the time I found the creek. I almost missed it. Just a dark line cutting through the white, barely visible under a layer of ice and snow. But the sound of water trickling somewhere beneath the surface made me stop and look closer. It was flowing, which meant it was heading somewhere, and somewhere was better than nowhere. I turned to follow it downstream, staying close to the bank but not too close, because I knew the snow could be hiding spots where the ice was thin. The temperature was dropping fast now. I could feel it in the air, this sharp edge that had not been there an hour ago, and my breath was coming out in thick clouds that froze on my beard and the edges of my hood. I checked my phone one more time. 23%, still no signal. And I took a picture of the creek and the direction I was heading, thinking that if someone found my body, at least they would know which way I had gone. That was when it really hit me, the possibility that I might actually die out here. Not as an abstract concept, but as a real and immediate thing that could happen in the next few hours. I thought about Naomi, about whether she had made it back to the car, about whether she was warm and safe and calling for help, or whether she was out here too. Somewhere in this frozen maze, as lost and scared as I was. I followed that creek for what must have been 2 miles, though it felt like 20. The banks were uneven and thick with undergrowth buried under snow, so I had to climb over fallen logs and push through branches that grabbed at my jacket like hands trying to hold me back. The cold had moved past my feet now and was creeping up my legs, this dull ache that made every step harder than the last. I kept talking to myself, out loud, just to make sure I still could, reciting song lyrics, listing the names of everyone at my office, describing what I was going to eat when I got home. Anything to keep my brain working, to fight off the fog that I knew was the first sign of serious hypothermia. The creek widened as I went, joined by smaller tributaries, and I took that as a good sign. Bigger water meant I was getting closer to the bottom of the mountain, closer to somewhere that people might actually be. And then, just as the last gray light was starting to fade into darkness, I saw something that made me want to collapse right there in the snow. A fence. A wooden fence, old and weathered, running along the far side of the creek. Fences meant property. Property meant people. People meant survival. I crossed the creek at a narrow spot where rocks broke the surface, soaking my boots in the icy water but not caring, because nothing mattered except getting to that fence. On the other side, I found a path. Not a trail, but an actual path, worn down by feet and maybe vehicles leading away from the creek through a stand of bare aspens. I followed it with the last energy I had, my legs moving on pure stubbornness, my hands so numb I could not feel them anymore. The path curved around a hill, and then I saw lights. Yellow lights, warm and glowing, coming from a small cabin maybe 300 yards ahead. I tried to run, but my body would not cooperate, so I shuffled as fast as I could, waving my arms even though no one was outside to see me. When I reached the porch, I pounded on the door with fists I could not feel, and when an old man opened it with a shotgun in his hands and suspicion on his face, I could barely get the words out. "Lost," I said. "Wife's still out there. Please help." He looked at me for a long moment, then lowered the gun and pulled me inside, and the heat from his wood stove hit me like a wall. He wrapped me in blankets and handed me a cup of something hot. I do not even remember what it was. And he picked up a landline phone and called search and rescue, while I sat there shaking so hard I could barely hold the cup. The next few hours were a blur of voices and radio static and headlights cutting through darkness. The old man, his name was Howard, I learned later, had lived on that mountain for 40 years and knew every inch of it, including the logging tracks I had stumbled through. He told the rescue team exactly where I had come from based on my description, and they recalculated their search grid to include that area. I wanted to go with them, wanted to be out there looking for Naomi, but my core temperature was dangerously low and they would not let me leave the cabin. A paramedic stayed with me, monitoring my vitals, slowly warming me up with heated blankets and warm fluids. Every minute that passed felt like an hour. I kept thinking about the cold outside, about how the temperature had probably dropped below 0 by now, about how Naomi was smaller than me and would lose heat faster. I prayed to a God I was not sure I believed in, making promises I knew I would keep if he just let her be okay. Around 9:30, the radio crackled with a transmission that made everyone in the room go quiet. They had found someone. Female. Red jacket. Conscious but hypothermic. They were bringing her down. Naomi had done everything right. When she realized we had gotten separated, she had stopped moving immediately and found shelter. A shallow depression beneath a rock overhang, barely big enough for her body, but enough to block the wind. She had wrapped herself in the emergency blanket from her pack, the one with the reflective silver coating, and she had stayed there for almost 5 hours, conserving energy, trusting that I would get help and send someone back for her. The rescue team found her because of that silver blanket. One of them caught a flash of reflected light from his headlamp and investigated. She had mild frostbite on 3 of her fingers and moderate hypothermia, but she was alive. They brought her to the cabin where I was waiting, and when I saw her walk through that door, pale, exhausted, her lips still slightly blue, I held her so tight that I thought I might never let go. We did not say anything for a long time. We did not need to. Howard stood in the corner of his kitchen, watching us with this quiet expression, and later he told me that in 40 years on that mountain, he had seen a lot of people get lost, and not all of them came back. We were lucky, he said. Stupid, but lucky. I could not argue with either part of that. We still hike, Naomi and I. We went back to Crescent Peak the following summer, stood at the spot where we got separated, and tried to figure out what had gone wrong. The answer was simple and humbling. We had overestimated our experience and underestimated the mountain. The storm that hit us was later classified as a microburst, a localized weather event that formed and dissipated within a few hours, too fast and too small for the regional forecast to catch. It was bad luck, pure and simple, the kind of thing that can happen to anyone no matter how prepared they think they are. But bad luck does not excuse bad decisions, and I made plenty of those once the storm hit. I should have stayed put when I lost Naomi. I should have trusted that she would do the smart thing, which she did, and that moving around blindly would only make everything worse. Instead, I let fear override logic, and I nearly got us both killed. These days we hike with GPS beacons, satellite communicators, and a strict rule that if we ever get separated again, we both stay exactly where we are and wait. We check weather forecasts obsessively, and we tell at least 3 people our exact route before we leave. Howard passed away last year. I saw his obituary in the local paper, and I drove up to his property to pay my respects. The cabin looks smaller in daylight, ordinary, just a wooden structure on the side of a mountain. But to me it will always be the place where I came back from the dead, where a stranger with a shotgun and a landline saved my life and my marriage. I left a bottle of whiskey on his porch with a note that said thank you, though I knew no one was there to read it. Some debts you can never really repay. You just carry them with you and try to be worthy of the second chance you were given. Saturday night, December 24th of 2022, and my wife Denise had been planning our little family gathering for weeks. We had moved into our house on Birchwood Lane just 8 months earlier, a modest 2-story place in a quiet neighborhood outside of Richmond, Virginia. My parents drove up from North Carolina, and Denise's sister Maggie came with her husband Owen and their 2 kids. Counting our own daughter Sophie, who had just turned 4, we had 9 people packed into a house that suddenly felt smaller than when we bought it. By 7 in the evening, the kitchen smelled like honey-glazed ham and my mother's famous sweet potato casserole. And Sophie was running circles around the Christmas tree with her cousins, their laughter bouncing off every wall. Having graduated college in 2008 during the recession, it took me 14 years to finally own a home where I could host a holiday dinner, and that night felt like proof that all the struggle had been worth something. The first knock came around 8:30, right when we were clearing the dinner plates and my father-in-law Owen was telling one of his long-winded stories about a fishing trip gone wrong. I remember pausing mid-step, a stack of dishes in my hands, thinking maybe one of the neighbors had stopped by to wish us happy holidays. We had met a few of them during the summer, mostly older couples who kept to themselves but seemed friendly enough. Denise caught my eye from across the dining room and shrugged, and I set the dishes on the counter before heading toward the front door. Our porch light was on, casting a yellow glow through the frosted glass panel beside the door, and I could see shapes standing there, more than one person, their silhouettes dark and still against the winter night. Something about the way they stood there, not moving, not talking among themselves, made me slow my pace before I reached the handle. I opened the door about halfway, keeping my body between the gap and the warmth of the house behind me. There were 4 of them standing on my porch, 3 men and 1 woman, none of them dressed for the weather. One of the men wore a thin denim jacket over a flannel shirt, and the woman had on a hoodie with the sleeves pushed up despite the temperature being in the low 30s. They ranged in age from maybe early 20s to somewhere around 50, and not one of them looked related to the others. The oldest man, a heavy-set guy with a patchy gray beard and deep-set eyes that caught the porch light in a way that made them look almost yellow, stepped forward and smiled at me. He said they were friends of Owen, that Owen had invited them to stop by for dessert, and he apologized for showing up unannounced. I turned my head back toward the dining room and called out to Owen, asking if he was expecting anyone, and Owen appeared in the hallway behind me with a confused look on his face, shaking his head slowly. When I turned back to the group, the story had already changed. The woman, who had stringy blonde hair and a nervous habit of picking at the skin around her fingernails, said they were actually friends of Maggie from her church group. I told her to hold on and went to get Maggie, who came to the door wiping her hands on a dish towel, and she stared at the four strangers with absolutely no recognition in her eyes. Maggie said she had never seen any of them before in her life, and that she did not belong to any church group. The youngest of the men, a skinny kid with acne scars and a shaved head, laughed awkwardly and said there must have been some kind of mix-up. Maybe they had the wrong house. But he did not move to leave, and neither did any of the others. They just stood there on my porch, breath fogging in the cold air, watching us with expressions that held something patient and calculating behind the surface politeness. The heavy-set man asked if they could at least come inside to warm up for a minute while they figured out where they were meant to be, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to say no. I told them I was sorry, but we were having a private family dinner, and that I could not let strangers into my home. The words came out firmer than I expected, and I saw something flicker behind the heavy-set man's eyes, a brief tightening around his mouth that disappeared as quickly as it came. He nodded slowly, almost theatrically, and said he understood completely, no hard feelings. Then he turned to the others and made a small gesture with his hand, just a slight movement of his fingers, and without another word the group stepped off my porch and began walking across the front yard. I watched them through the frosted glass as they reached the sidewalk, expecting them to head toward a car parked on the street, but instead they split up. The woman and the young guy with the shaved head went left, disappearing around the corner of my neighbor's fence, while the heavy-set man and the fourth member of the group, a wiry man in his 40s who had not spoken a single word the entire time, went right and vanished into the shadows between the streetlights. I closed the door and locked it, then stood there for a moment trying to convince myself that everything was fine. Owen asked what that was all about, and I told him I had no idea. Probably just some confused people who got the wrong address. But even as I said it, I did not believe it. There was something rehearsed about the way they had approached us, something coordinated about the way they had scattered when I refused them entry. Denise appeared at my side and asked if everything was okay, and I forced a smile and told her it was nothing. My father was helping the kids build a tower out of empty wrapping paper tubes in the living room, and my mother was slicing pie in the kitchen, and for a few minutes I let myself get pulled back into the warmth and noise of the holiday. I checked the front door lock twice without really thinking about it, and then I went to help my mother carry dessert plates to the dining room table. That was when I heard the handle of the back door rattle, a slow, deliberate sound that cut through the laughter, like a knife through paper. I set the plates down so hard that one of them cracked against the table, and I moved toward the kitchen without saying a word. The back door had a window in the upper half, covered by a thin curtain that Denise had hung when we moved in, and through the fabric I could see a shape standing just outside. Whoever it was did not knock, did not call out, just stood there working the handle back and forth as if testing whether the lock would hold. I reached the door and yanked the curtain aside, and found myself staring directly into the face of the woman with the stringy blonde hair. She was standing so close to the glass that her breath left a circle of fog on the surface, and when our eyes met, she did not step back or look surprised. She just smiled, a wide, empty smile that showed too many teeth, and then she let go of the handle and took one step backward into the darkness of my yard. I could hear Owen behind me now, asking what was going on, and I heard Denise telling the kids to stay in the living room in a voice that was trying very hard to sound calm. I grabbed my phone from the kitchen counter and dialed 911, my fingers moving faster than my thoughts. The dispatcher answered and I told her there were people surrounding my house, that they had tried to get in through the front door and were now trying the back, and that I had my entire family inside, including 3 small children. She asked for my address and I gave it to her, and she told me units were being dispatched and to stay on the line. Owen had gone to check the windows in the dining room, and he came back saying he could see someone moving along the side of the house, staying close to the wall where the shadows were deepest. My father appeared in the kitchen doorway holding a carving knife from the dinner table, his face pale but his jaw set in a hard line, and he asked me how many of them there were. I told him 4, at least 4, and he nodded once and positioned himself near the back door. The dispatcher was asking me questions I could barely process, and somewhere in the living room I heard Sophie asking her mother why everyone looked so scared. The next few minutes stretched out into something that felt like hours. We gathered everyone into the living room, away from the windows, and Denise sat on the floor with the 3 kids, reading them a story from one of Sophie's new Christmas books, in a voice that barely trembled. My mother sat beside them, her hand resting on my daughter's back, and I could see her lips moving in what I think was a silent prayer. Owen and my father and I took positions where we could watch the doors and the main windows, and Maggie stood near the hallway with her phone out, recording video of the front yard through a gap in the curtains. The dispatcher stayed on the line, her voice a steady anchor in the chaos, telling me the officers were 7 minutes out, then 5, then 3. I kept expecting to hear glass breaking, kept expecting one of those strangers to come crashing through a window, but instead there was only silence from outside, a thick, oppressive silence that was almost worse than noise would have been. They were still out there, I knew they were, circling the house like wolves waiting for a gap in the fence. At 9:14, I saw the flash of red and blue lights painting the walls of my living room, and I have never felt relief like that in my entire life. 2 patrol cars pulled up to the curb, and I watched through the window as 4 officers got out with flashlights already in their hands. I told the dispatcher they had arrived, and she said I could hang up, and I went to the front door and opened it to meet the first officer on the porch. He was a tall man with a shaved head and a calm demeanor, and he asked me to describe what had happened, while his partner began walking the perimeter of the house with his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I told him everything: the knock, the changing stories, the way they had scattered, the woman at the back door, and he listened without interrupting, just nodding occasionally and taking notes. His partner came back around the corner of the house and said there was no one in the yard, no one in the back, no sign of forced entry on any of the doors or windows. They checked the side gate, the garage, even looked behind the shed where I kept the lawn equipment, and found nothing but footprints in the frost-covered grass, at least 4 distinct sets leading from the back door toward the fence line and then disappearing into the neighbor's property. The officers took statements from all of us, and Maggie showed them the video she had recorded, though it was too dark to make out much more than shapes moving in the yard. One of the officers, a woman with short gray hair who had been canvassing the street, came back and told us that a neighbor 3 houses down had seen a white van parked at the end of the block earlier that evening, one she did not recognize from the neighborhood. The van had been there when she took her dog out around 7, and it was gone by the time the patrol cars arrived. The officers exchanged a look that I did not like, a look that told me this was not the first time they had heard about something like this. One of them mentioned that there had been a string of home invasions in the county over the past few months, all targeting houses during family gatherings when the occupants would be distracted and the doors might be unlocked. He said we were lucky, that the fact we had not let them in and had called quickly was probably what saved us. He did not say what had happened to the families who had not been so careful, and I did not ask. We filed a police report, and the officers gave us a case number, and they promised to increase patrols in the area for the next few weeks. After they left, nobody felt much like celebrating anymore. My parents decided to stay the night instead of driving back, and Owen and Maggie put their kids to bed in Sophie's room, while the adults sat in the living room with the lights on and the doors double-checked. I do not think any of us slept more than an hour or 2 that night. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows, sent my heart racing all over again. I kept seeing that woman's face pressed close to the glass, that smile that held nothing behind it but patience and intent. The police never found them, never identified them, never made an arrest. About a month later, I read in the local paper that a family in Henrico County had been robbed at gunpoint on New Year's Day. 4 intruders who had talked their way inside by claiming to be lost and asking to use the phone. I stared at that article for a long time, wondering if it was the same people, wondering what would have happened if I had opened that door just a little wider. The winter I took that night shift at the little 24-hour convenience store felt like something I agreed to, out of stubbornness more than necessity. At the time, I was juggling community college classes during the day and trying to save enough money to move out of the apartment I shared with my cousin. Night shifts were quiet, predictable, and honestly a break from the chaos of everything else. That particular night, the cold outside didn't feel real until you stepped near the front windows, ice crusted along the edges, like the glass was slowly shrinking. I remember pacing the aisles around 1 a.m., organizing things that didn't need to be organized, just trying to stay awake while the heater rattled in that uneven way it always did during the deep freezes. Closing hours didn't technically apply to us, but our manager insisted we lock the doors between 2 and 3 a.m. so we could restock safely. I hated that hour. Customers could see the lights on and still come up to the door, and I'd have to mime closed through the glass like an idiot. That night, I had just finished taking out a trash bag when I heard sharp tapping on the front window. Not loud, more like hurried, uneven knocks. A man stood there, wrapped in a thin hoodie so soaked with frost it looked stiff. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his face carried this pinched expression, like the cold had peeled away everything except desperation. He mouthed something, then knocked again, faster. I walked up to the door, holding my arms tight across my chest because the cold seeped through the frame. Before I could say anything, he pressed his palm flat against the glass and blurted out, "Please, can you just let me in for a minute, just to warm up? I just need a minute." His voice had that trembling edge that made me instinctively want to help, but rules were rules, and we'd been warned repeatedly not to open the doors under any circumstances. I shook my head gently, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained through the crack in the auxiliary speaker that I couldn't unlock it. His expression shifted, not anger exactly, but this tightening around his jaw, like my refusal had knocked something loose inside him. I stepped back a little, expecting him to leave, but instead his gaze shifted past me, toward something behind my shoulder. When I turned slightly, I noticed another figure outside, a second man standing several feet behind him in the snow. He wore a dark coat and kept both hands in his pockets. No visible tension, no shivering, no attempt to get closer. He just stood there, unmoving, his face shadowed by the store's overhang. The first man looked from him to me, then leaned in again, knocking harder now, each strike echoing through the empty store. I backed away farther, and as soon as I did, the two of them peeled off in opposite directions like they had choreographed it, heading toward the side doors and testing every handle they could find. They moved with this unsettling coordination, never speaking to each other, never calling out, just checking door after door like they already knew the layout. I hurried behind the counter and hit the security lock button, even though I wasn't sure it did anything beyond making me feel less exposed. Through the side window, I saw the first man tugging at the metal handle so aggressively that the whole frame vibrated. The other one walked slower, dragging his boots through the snow in a careful line, almost like he was tracing a path he'd followed before. The store felt smaller with each of their attempts. Every sound echoed, each rattle of a door, each scrape against the siding. I tried calling our overnight manager, but the call went straight to voicemail, and the silence in my ear after the beep made my throat tighten. I crouched low behind the counter, peeking through the bottom portion of the glass, hoping they'd give up. Instead, I heard the crunch of snow near the back delivery area. One of them had gone around the building, maybe both. I couldn't see anything from that angle, only the faint blue headlights from a car parked at the far end of the lot. Its trunk was wide open, the interior light flickering every few seconds, as if the bulb was dying. I hadn't noticed the car earlier, which was strange because the lot was usually empty at that hour. The open trunk made me nauseous in a way I couldn't rationalize, like I was staring at a problem with an answer I didn't want to know. When I finally stood up enough to look through the front window again, the first man reappeared, this time much closer to the glass than before. His breath fogged the surface in uneven bursts. He wasn't knocking now. He was staring directly into the store, scanning every aisle behind me as if counting the steps it would take to get to each one. Before I could duck again, he tried the door one more time, gripping it so tightly his knuckles went pale. Then he stepped aside without warning, and the second man came into view from the opposite direction. They exchanged a look, not quite communication, more like they were confirming something silently, and then both walked briskly toward the back of the building again. I grabbed the store phone and called 911, whispering because my voice felt too loud in the empty aisles. The dispatcher kept asking for details, but all I could do was describe the two men circling the building and the open trunk in the lot. While I was on the call, a sharp metallic clang hit the back door, followed by another and another, steady, deliberate strikes. I told the dispatcher about it, and she said an officer was already en route, but the closest one was several minutes away. I remember pressing my hand against the underside of the counter to stop myself from pacing, trying to decide whether to hide in the storage room or stay where the security cameras could see me. Before I made up my mind, the clanging stopped, replaced by a long swiping sound, like someone dragging something heavy across the ice near the back entrance. The dragging sound moved slowly along the rear wall of the store, pausing every few seconds before continuing, as if they were positioning something or testing angles. I stayed crouched, barely breathing, trying to listen through the hum of the outdated freezer unit behind me. Then, without warning, the security lights on the side of the building flickered on, casting a sharp white glow across the snow. In that brief illumination, I saw both men standing near the corner of the lot, not at the door anymore, but beside their car. The first man paced in a tight circle, rubbing his sleeves like he was warming up for something, while the second stood motionless beside the open trunk. Whatever they were doing, it felt deliberate, like there was a sequence to their actions that I wasn't meant to understand. The harsh lights clicked off again, plunging everything back into that bluish winter darkness. I ducked out of sight, terrified they'd seen me watching. A few seconds later, I heard a new sound, the slow crunch of footsteps approaching the front door once more. But only one set this time. I risked lifting my head just above the counter, and there he was, the first man leaning close to the glass, his breath spreading across it in frantic patterns. His face looked different now, almost eager, as if he believed something had changed. He cupped his hands around his eyes and scanned the store with this unsettling patience, neither knocking nor speaking. Just waiting. Before I could pull back again, headlights swept across the parking lot, cutting through the frost-coated windows. A patrol car rolled in, tires crunching through the hard-packed ice. At the sight of it, the man at the door whipped his head toward the lot, then sprinted toward the car with the open trunk. The second man slammed the trunk shut with a violent thud, and the two of them jumped inside their vehicle before the officer even had time to step out. Their engine revved hard, fishtailing as they tore out of the lot and disappeared down the road, spraying snow everywhere in their rush to get away. The patrol car tried to follow but lost traction, giving them several seconds of advantage, more than enough for them to vanish into the dark. The officer eventually came inside to check the building, making sure no doors had been tampered with. He walked around with me, shining his flashlight along the back wall and the frozen pavement, but whatever they had dragged or moved left no clear marks, just smeared patches in the snow where the ground looked disturbed. The open trunk, the way they circled the store, their silent coordination, none of it added up. The officer stayed until sunrise, but the men never came back, and their car was never identified from the description I gave. Even now, I still wonder what would have happened if I had unlocked that door. If the story would have ended inside that trunk instead of behind a counter, waiting for help that barely arrived in time. The evening had turned into one of those stubborn winter storms that seemed to appear out of nowhere, even though the forecast had only hinted at flurries. I was heading back from a small consulting job in a quiet town a couple of hours from where I live, cutting through a stretch of rural road that barely saw traffic on normal days. My routine back then was pretty simple. Take whatever freelance work came my way, drive long distances, and try to get home before the weather decided to test my patience. That night, the snow was falling so thick it looked like static on a broken TV screen, and the wind kept pushing my car just enough to make me grip the wheel harder. By the time I reached a narrow part of the road where the trees leaned in so close they felt like a tunnel, my tires slid over a sheet of ice I hadn't seen. The car swerved, dragged sideways, and ended up lodged against a sloped patch of frozen dirt. The engine was still running, but the wheels spun uselessly. I remember sitting there for a moment, listening to the rhythmic thump of branches hitting the roof, trying to decide if I should call for help or wait it out. My phone signal flickered between 1 bar and none, and the cold had already started seeping in through the gaps around the doors. The storm made everything strangely silent, like the world outside was wrapped in cotton. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, hoping another car might appear, though I hadn't seen headlights for nearly half an hour. That road wasn't the kind people chose unless they lived nearby or had no other option. I told myself I'd try rocking the car free one more time before giving up, but the wheels just spun, spraying snow behind me. A knot of frustration built in my chest, mixed with the uncomfortable realization that I was more alone out there than I'd expected. That's why the sudden glow of headlights behind me felt like a miracle. They rounded the bend slowly, the beams cutting through the thick curtain of snow until a pickup truck rolled into view. Its engine rumbled louder than I anticipated, and it stopped a little closer to my bumper than people usually do in weather like that. For a moment, all I felt was relief. I kept thinking, finally someone else is on this road, someone who might have a tow strap or at least a phone signal strong enough to call a real tow truck. Before I could even get out of my car, 2 men stepped out of the pickup, their silhouettes outlined by the headlights. Both wore reflective vests, the kind road crews or volunteers might use. One of them waved at me with quick, assertive motions, like he'd done this dozens of times. The sight made my tension ease just a bit, enough that I opened my door and leaned out to talk to them. The first man approached with a steady gait, his boots crunching through the snow in a slow, heavy rhythm. Up close, he looked to be in his late 30s, clean-shaven with a square jaw, and a voice that carried easily over the wind. He told me they were volunteer responders who patrolled the rural roads during storms, helping out anyone stranded. His partner hung back at first, standing near the tailgate of the truck with his hands tucked inside his vest. Something about their coordination felt rehearsed, but not in a professional way, more like 2 people trying to imitate a role they'd studied, but never actually performed. My eyes drifted to their vests, and that's when the first poke of unease reached me. The patterns didn't match. One had bright orange stripes running horizontally, while the other had narrow diagonal ones in dull yellow. They weren't part of any group I'd ever seen, and the pickup behind them had absolutely no markings, not even a magnet decal. My relief thinned out fast. The man closest to me leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as if we were sharing a secret no one else should hear. He said the cold could mess with a person fast in storms like this, and that I should get into their truck to warm up while they figured out how to free my car. His tone had that forced calm people use when trying to steer someone toward a choice without making it sound like pressure. I told him I was fine staying where I was, that the heater still worked. His expression barely shifted, but something in his posture tightened, like he wasn't expecting me to decline. Behind him, his partner began pacing slowly toward the back of my car, each step measured and deliberate. I couldn't see his face clearly, only the dim reflection of my brake lights glinting off the wet fabric of his vest. But he moved with purpose. Too much purpose for someone just trying to help. I kept one foot outside the car, the other still inside, torn between politeness and that rising internal alarm people get when they sense a situation changing shape. Snowflakes were landing on the first man's eyelashes, sticking there as he spoke again. this time insisting that their truck had better heat than mine. He added that it wasn't safe for me to stay alone, not in weather like this. Something about the way he phrased it made the hairs on my arms lift. I glanced past him toward their vehicle, expecting to see some sort of equipment, shovels, chains, emergency lights. But the bed was empty. No salt bags, no tow straps. Just an old blue cooler and a single tarp that looked brand new compared to the rest of the truck. That contrast bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Then the first man slipped his hand into his jacket, slowly, like he was reaching for something he wanted to have ready but didn't want me to notice. The motion was subtle, almost casual, but the intention behind it felt incredibly wrong. My breath caught in my chest as every instinct I had screamed to pay attention. At the same time, the other man had moved farther behind my car, his boots disappearing from my side mirror as he positioned himself directly behind the trunk, completely blocking any shot of me reversing out. I hadn't even realized how boxed in I'd become until that moment. The storm continued to batter everything around us, muting sounds and making the world feel smaller, tighter, like the three of us were trapped inside a snow globe. Trying to keep my voice steady, I told them I just needed a push, not a ride, and that someone else was already on the way, which wasn't true, but I needed something to shift the mood. The man closest to me pulled his hand back out of his jacket, not empty but still obscured by his sleeve, and he stepped a little closer, narrowing the space between us. His partner tapped the back of my car twice, hard enough to jolt it slightly, like he wanted me to know exactly where he was. The uneasiness had grown into something sharper, something that pressed against my ribs from the inside. Every bit of warmth from my heater suddenly felt useless. It was clear now. They weren't there to help me, and whatever they had planned wasn't going to involve me driving away easily. With both men closing in on me from different angles, I realized staying half inside the car was a mistake. I pulled my leg back in fully and shut the door, not slamming it, but firm enough that they'd hear it through the wind. The first man immediately tried the handle, giving it a quick tug like he assumed it would still be unlocked. When it didn't budge, he leaned toward the window and told me I was making things harder than they needed to be. His voice dropped low enough that the words felt directed at me alone, not meant for the storm or his partner. I didn't reply. I just reached down and hit the button that locked all the doors at once. The sound was small, barely audible over the weather, but the shift it caused in his expression was unmistakable. He no longer pretended to be helpful. I put the car in gear, even though I knew the wheels would just spin. The engine whined as the tires tried and failed to grip the ice. The man behind my car stepped closer, bracing both hands against the trunk as if daring me to try again. Their headlights cast their shadows long and warped across the snow, stretching them like figures in a fever dream. I kept my eyes forward, searching for any patch of ground that looked even remotely solid enough to catch traction. Meanwhile, the first man rapped his knuckles against the window, not angrily but rhythmically, like he was waiting for me to brake before he did. The whole situation had collapsed from minor roadside incident into something predatory, fast enough to make my thoughts scatter. A gust of wind hit the trees above us, breaking loose a sheet of snow that crashed down onto the hood of my car. The sound startled both men just enough to give me a second of breathing room. I took advantage of it, gently rocking the car back and forth in the narrow space it had. At first, nothing changed. Then the back right tire nudged against a patch of rougher ice, still slippery, but textured enough to feel different under the wheels. I eased onto the gas the moment I felt it. The car jerked sideways, almost stalling out, but the movement forced the man behind me to step back or risk getting clipped. He shouted something I couldn't make out, but his voice had lost its calm veneer. That alone was enough to push me to try again. The second attempt worked better than I could have hoped. The tire caught just enough traction to pull the car free from the slope, lurching it forward several feet. I didn't stop to think or look back. I kept accelerating, letting the car fishtail along the road until it straightened itself out. In the mirror, the men were silhouettes swallowed by the storm, their truck still parked, headlights glaring through the snow like twin angry eyes. They didn't try to follow me, at least not that I ever saw. I drove until the storm thinned and the first cluster of distant porch lights came into view, and only then did I pull over to breathe again. I never filed a report because I had no names, no plates, nothing concrete. But whenever winter returns and I find myself on a lonely road, I think about those mismatched vests and the way they moved with such quiet intention. Whatever they wanted that night, I'm certain it wasn't to help. Snow trips weren't really my thing back then, but that winter I was trying hard to get out of a rut, so when my friend Jordan suggested a quick day hike on a popular trail near his town, I went along without thinking too much. Life was quiet for me in those days, working remote, barely talking to neighbors, spending most weekends trying to pretend I wasn't feeling stuck. The trail was considered safe and well marked, a place families visited for photos whenever fresh snow fell. That morning the sky had that chalky gray look that makes the whole landscape feel flat, and Jordan kept joking about how it felt like we were walking through an old postcard. I remember noticing how the cold made every sound snap sharply, like twigs breaking much closer than they really were. Nothing seemed strange at first. We were just two friends trying to shake off the winter blues. The hike turned eerie faster than either of us expected. About an hour in, a scream sliced through the trees, high, raw, and panicked, the kind that makes you instinctively lock your jaw. Jordan stopped mid-sentence, staring at me like he wasn't sure if I'd heard the same thing. The sound didn't resemble any animal I knew, and the woods around us went unusually still right after, as if the whole place was listening. We followed the trail a little farther, half expecting another hiker to run past us asking for help. But no one appeared, and the silence kept stretching in this heavy, unnatural way. I remember tugging my scarf up to my chin, not because of the cold, but because the air suddenly felt too open. Curiosity eventually pushed us off the trail. The snow was fresh enough that anything moving through the area would have left tracks, and we figured we'd at least find signs of some animal in distress. Instead, we found a single line of human boot prints, deep, sharp impressions that veered into a narrow pocket of trees where branches formed a kind of crooked arch overhead. No paw prints, no drag marks, nothing suggesting wildlife. Jordan tried to call out, his voice echoing strangely like it was bouncing off something farther away. The boot prints looked recent, maybe minutes old, and something about how they were spaced made my chest tighten. They were steady, deliberate, not the footsteps of someone running in fear. We followed them only a short distance before spotting him. A man stood between the trees about 50 yards ahead, wearing a dark coat dusted with snow, his posture rigid as if he'd been waiting for us to notice. He didn't wave, didn't speak, didn't even shift his weight. He just stared in our direction with an intensity that made the cold feel sharper. Jordan tried calling out again, but the man didn't react. He simply turned and walked deeper into the woods, leaving that same neat trail of prints. Something in the way he moved, slow, unhurried, almost guiding, made me uneasy, but Jordan insisted we shouldn't assume anything bad. Still, when the man reappeared a second time, standing even farther out but in the same rigid pose, I remember feeling a creeping realization that he was leading us somewhere, not trying to escape us. Snow kept drifting down in soft, uneven sheets as we moved deeper into the trees, following the boot prints without speaking much. The official trail had vanished behind us, swallowed by the cold air and the dense branches overhead, but neither of us wanted to admit how turned around we were. Each time we paused, a faint sound would carry through the woods, sometimes a short, clipped cry, other times something that mimicked a distant gasp. It felt like whoever was making those noises was always just out of sight, shifting positions the moment we tried to pinpoint them. Jordan kept glancing back, like he expected the man to appear behind us again, but the only thing visible was this dull, washed-out landscape smudged with gray light. We spotted the man for the third time near an old, half-fallen pine. His coat looked heavier now, weighed down by accumulated snow, and he stood at a strange angle, as though his feet were planted, but his upper body leaned slightly forward. What unsettled me most was how perfectly still he held himself. No visible breath, no twitch of his shoulders, no adjustment for warmth. As soon as he saw that we were looking, he stepped away into a narrow valley between two ridges. It wasn't a normal walking motion. It was too smooth, almost practiced, like someone retracing steps they'd taken too many times. Jordan muttered that maybe he was injured or confused, but I kept focusing on the fact that he never once tried to signal for help. The screams came again, sharper and closer than before. This time they ricocheted between the trees in a way that felt intentional, like they were being projected from different points. I remember stopping so abruptly that the cold bit through the back of my knees. We listened, really listened, and realized the echoes weren't random. They circled us. Jordan whispered that we should go back the way we came, but the snow had already filled in most of our footprints, and every direction felt identical. The only path still clear was the one the man had made. For a moment, I felt this childish urge to call out and demand whoever was screaming to speak clearly, to say something human, something grounding. But my throat tightened each time I tried. We followed the valley the man had taken, mostly because it was the only choice that didn't feel like pure guesswork. The air there felt heavier, muffled in a way I'd never experienced outdoors. The trees grew close enough that their branches curved overhead like ribs, and the snow beneath them looked untouched, except for the prints we kept trailing behind. Then Jordan grabbed my sleeve and pointed. There he was again, standing perfectly still in the center of a small clearing, waiting. He lifted one arm, not waving, not beckoning, just raising it slightly as though marking a direction. And as we watched, the surrounding woods let out one long, dragging scream that didn't sound like any living creature I could place. It felt rehearsed, almost mechanical, and it came from everywhere at once. The man lowered his arm and turned away again, slipping between a cluster of trees so densely packed, they looked like they were stitched together. Jordan wanted to yell at him, to demand he stop and explain what he wanted, but the scream that followed cut him off. It came from just behind us, even though there was no one there. I spun around so fast my boots slid on the ice, and the only thing I saw was a thin trail of snow falling from a branch, as if something had brushed past it seconds before. The silence that followed wasn't natural. It pressed in around us, thick and waiting, like the woods were holding their breath for our next move. Jordan leaned close and said we shouldn't follow the man anymore, that we needed to pick a direction and commit to it, even if we weren't sure. But the truth was that any direction besides his felt like stepping blindfolded into a void. We walked quickly, choosing a path that angled slightly uphill, hoping it would lead us back toward the main ridge. For a few minutes the forest seemed calmer, the sounds settling into their normal winter hush. Then the boot prints appeared again, not ours, but his, cutting across our path at a perfect right angle, as if he'd predicted exactly where we'd try to go. They were fresh, impossibly fresh. Jordan stopped walking altogether, staring at them like they'd sprouted out of the snow. I remember whispering his name and feeling this strange heat rise in my chest, the kind that comes from being watched. We didn't see the man right away, but I knew he was close. The air around us shifted in a subtle way, like something large had just changed position without making a sound. Jordan spotted him first. The man stood halfway up the hill, facing us this time. His coat hung strangely on his frame, stretched in places where it shouldn't be, and the snow around him looked disturbed even though he stood perfectly still. The worst part was his head. It was tilted at an angle that made my neck ache just looking at it, as though he was listening for something behind us rather than watching us directly. Jordan whispered that we should go around him, skirt the hill and head toward the open clearing he pointed out earlier on our map. But when we moved sideways, the man shifted instantly, mirroring our angle without taking a step. It didn't make sense. 1 second he was yards away. The next he was aligned with us perfectly again. Like the distance between us had folded. We bolted, not elegantly, not bravely, just pure instinct. Branches snagged our sleeves, snow kicked up behind us, and my lungs burned from the cold. The woods blurred into streaks of white and brown, and for a moment I didn't even care which direction we were going as long as it was away from him. When we finally stumbled into a clearing, an area with a faded wooden trail marker half buried in snow, I nearly collapsed from relief. Civilization had to be close. Behind us, the woods settled into an unnatural quiet. No screams, no footsteps, no figure watching from between the trees. It was as if the entire forest had shut its eyes. Jordan and I didn't talk much on the way back to the parking lot. We kept expecting to hear another cry or see that man standing somewhere behind us, but the woods stayed silent the entire hike out. When we reached the trailhead, a pair of rangers were checking the posted conditions. They asked if we'd gone off trail because they'd found sets of boot prints leading into areas no one should be wandering this time of year. We told them everything, every scream, every appearance of the man, and one ranger's face tightened in a way he tried to hide. He said people got turned around easily in winter. That sound behaves strangely in the cold, and that sometimes you convince yourself you're being followed when you're not. But then he added quietly that if we ever heard screaming in that forest again, we should leave immediately. No investigation, no heroics, just leave. We never found out who the man was or why his boot prints kept crossing ours in places we knew we'd never walked. But I haven't been back to that trail since, and Jordan refuses to even drive near the area. Whatever was out there that day didn't want help. It wanted us deeper in those woods. And if we hadn't run when we did, I'm not sure either of us would have found our way back out.